Hello everyone. In this video, we will be presenting the VARC solutions for CAT 2023 Slot 2. I think most of us would agree that the VARC section was on predictable lines. Some would probably say that it was easy, but at most, it can only be classified as moderate. I don't think that difficult is the word to use for it. So that would warrant a pretty high number of attempts if you want to do well in the VARC section. We have already said that a good number of attempts out of 24 questions would be somewhere between 17 to 19. Now, if you look at the section and how we would achieve these 17 to 19 attempts, it would have to be broken up between RC and VA. Barring a few small changes, the VARC section was fairly similar to CAT 2022. We saw that there were 4 passages with 4 questions each and that there were 8 VA questions. But then the similarity ends. Within VA, there was a very small surprise for some of us. Instead of having 3 question types, which is summary, parajumbles, and paracompletion, we also had the odd sentence question type. There were 2 questions of each variety, and I think some students probably misread the instructions or did not read the instructions and solved the odd sentence question as a parajumble, which is just unfortunate. There was another strange facet of slot 2, which we did not really see in other slots. There was one theta question that was marked as a mandatory question. Now, we don't really know what would happen if you don't answer the mandatory question, but we do know that since it was theta, it was best to mark some answer and move on. Now, out of 4 passages, we have seen in the past that usually only one passage is a little challenging, and such was the case in slot 2 as well. Apart from that, there were 2 passages which were on the easy side, one passage which would be classified as moderate. So that means that I could definitely attempt about 11 to 12 questions, even if I did not do one entire passage. Within VA, we saw that the questions probably lay between easy to medium. There were very few difficult questions. So there also out of 8, I could have done anything between 5 to all 8 questions. So in this slot, to be competitive, a high number of attempts was definitely required with about 70 to 75% accuracy. So if you were able to do this, then you can be pretty confident of getting a good score. And in case your attempts are fewer than what we have said, let's just wait for the result and see how it pans out. Wish you all the best for your results. This passage is pretty easy to understand, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of the topic. And I felt that the questions were also fairly simple, barring perhaps one question. So on the whole, this should be a pretty scoring passage for most students. The first 2 paragraphs talk about second-hand clothing. If you look at the first paragraph, it says that some organizations such as Oxfam, they're encouraging people to shop at local organizations and charities as alternatives to fast fashion brands such as Primark and Boohoo. Why? To save our planet. And the second paragraph talks about why this is being done. Apparently, Brits or Britishers buy more garments than any other country in Europe. So it comes as no shock that many of those clothes end up in UK landfills. So clearly, when we generate a lot of waste, it leads to a negative impact for the planet. The mismanagement of our waste has even come back to haunt us on our dinner plate. In other words, it is now also affecting the food chain that leads up to humans. So what we are talking about here is the environmental impact of waste clothing. And in the first 2 paragraphs, the author is trying to simply give us a few observations that excessive clothing consumption is bad for the environment. So this part is not very difficult to understand. Let's move on to the third paragraph. Now, the third and fourth again have been combined because the fourth one is pretty short. We are saying in paragraph 3 that because people are now aware that excessive clothing or wastage of clothing is bad for the environment, they're looking for a solution. What is the solution? The most common one is buying second-hand clothing. Retailers selling consigned clothing are currently expanding at a rapid rate. If everyone bought just one used item in a year, it would save a lot of waste. So clearly, it seems as if people are now buying second-hand items in an effort to save the planet. But paragraph 4 is saying that is it simply something that we need to do to be cool and feel satisfied that we are doing for the planet? Or do we need to maybe think a little bit deeper and ask ourselves, are my actions actually creating an impact? So paragraph 3 and 4 say that people are taking steps and they're opting for second-hand clothing, but this may not necessarily be impactful. So let's move on to the next paragraph and see what the author is really trying to say, because so far the author is just telling us what the current scenario is. Now, it is in paragraph 4 that the author really gets to the point. Here, the author is saying that older clothes are actually not very good for the environment. According to a study commissioned by Patagonia, for instance, older clothes shed more microfibers. These can end up in our rivers and seas after just one wash due to worn material, which obviously contributes to microfiber pollution. So the author is trying to say that, look, it's nice that you're trying to buy second-hand clothing and also feeling cool in the process, but is it really good for the environment? Maybe not, because worn or older garments actually shed more and they actually contribute to more pollution. So what is one to do? The author says that they would be well advised to buy high-quality items that shed less and last longer, as this combats both microfiber pollution and excess garments ending up in the landfills. So the solution, according to the author, is to buy high-quality clothing instead of just second-hand clothing. Why? Well, if we think about it, if we buy something that is very good quality, it is likely to last longer and therefore we're not going to throw it away very quickly. That will obviously curb the waste that goes to the landfills. But apart from that, every time that we wash those clothes in the machine or by hand, it really doesn't matter, the clothing sheds fiber. And this fiber obviously washes up into our rivers and finally the seas. So good quality garments will shed less. So again, going back to the argument, what the author has said so far is that there is a problem. People have arrived at some sort of a solution, but actually the solution is something else. Since older clothes shed more microfibers, consumers should buy high quality items that shed less and actually last longer. Now let's look at the last paragraph. Here the author seems to be talking about something else a little different. Luxury brands would rather not circulate their latest season stock around the globe to be sold at a cheaper price, which is why companies like ThreadUp, a US fashion resale marketplace, have not yet caught on in the UK. So what the author is trying to say here kind of adds to whatever we have discussed earlier. The author is saying that people should be encouraged to buy high quality clothing. But how are they supposed to buy high quality clothing? Unless luxury brands are willing to make their clothes available at lower prices. And apparently luxury brands are not very keen on this, because they don't want to sell their clothes at a cheaper price. It will probably dilute the brand. The last part of this paragraph says that second-hand luxury goods are not in the psyche of certain people. So one part is that the brand itself may not want to sell clothes at a cheaper rate. The second part is that there are some people who are not willing to buy second-hand clothes. But yes, there are others who are definitely willing, because we've already established that it is gaining in popularity. And after this, it says that Ben Whitaker, director at liquidation firm B-Stock, said that unless recycling becomes cost-effective and filters into mass production, high-end retailers would rather put brand before sustainability. So what we're saying here is that recycling currently is a little expensive, so that is not really being used at the rate that we would like it to. So let's try to sum up the argument here. What we're trying to establish is that luxury brands will obviously prioritize the brand image over sustainability. And this gets in the way of widespread acceptance of second-hand luxury goods in the market. Now we know that the entire passage revolves around second-hand clothing and whether it works for or against the environment. So let's do a very quick passage recap and take a look at the questions. In the very first paragraph, we established that excessive clothing consumption is bad for the planet. Then we said that people are now opting for second-hand clothing to reduce clothing waste and also pollution in general. But we said that maybe this is not the most effective way to deal with the problem. Why? Because older clothes actually shed more microfibers, which contributes to microfiber pollution. So a better way perhaps would be to buy high quality clothing that lasts longer. And finally, we said that luxury brands are a little reluctant to sell their clothes at cheaper rates, and this is getting in the way of people purchasing high quality second-hand clothes. Now, let's talk about the main idea of the whole passage. We've been talking about second-hand clothing and how excessive clothing consumption is bad for the planet. So my main idea is probably going to revolve around this, but we have to make sure that it also takes into account the author's suggestion. And what is the author's suggestion? The author is saying that while people are opting for second-hand clothing in order to curb the environmental impact of waste clothing, it might actually be better to focus on buying higher quality items that last longer. Now that we've understood the passage, which honestly is not very difficult to understand, I think we should be able to answer most of the questions. Now, I had said at the beginning that one of the questions is a little tricky. Let's take a look. This question here says the central idea of the passage would be undermined if. Now, this is a two-step question. First, we have to figure out what the central idea is. Luckily, we have already done that, so we don't have to really think about that. And then the word undermine means weaken. So it's also a reasoning question. So we have to weaken the central idea. We have already established that the central idea is that people are trying to buy second-hand clothing, but actually maybe they should be focusing on buying higher quality clothing. Now, how do I weaken this central idea? Maybe I am not able to arrive at the exact option, but I can at least state the function of what the right option should do for me. I can weaken this argument by either saying that buying second-hand clothing is the solution to the problem, because the author is kind of saying that it may not be the thing to do. Or I could say that buying high-quality clothing is not the solution. So there are multiple ways to weaken the same argument. Now let's take a look. Even if I don't find something that resembles these 2 points, maybe I will find something that at least talks about these 2 points. The first option here says Primark and Boohoo recycle their clothes for vintage stores. Now what we have to understand is that the entire passage or the central idea is not really recycling. What we are talking about is that there is something that is bad for the planet, there is a potential solution to it, but it may not be the real solution. But it is not about Primark and Boohoo, it is about waste clothing and what it does for our environment or does to our environment in general. So I would discard the first option because it is very specific and the fact that it talks about recycling. So let's eliminate it. The second one says customers bought all their clothes online. But this doesn't really tell us whether this is a good thing, whether this is a bad thing, will it solve the problem, will it not solve the problem. If you looked at the first paragraph, the author does seem to suggest that buying clothes online may not be a good thing. But he does not really come back to that point later. So I think it's fairly easy to discard this option as well. It does not really touch upon the shadow answer that we have framed at the beginning. Now let's take a look at option 3, which says second-hand stores sold only high-quality clothes. The reason that I would probably love this option is that it is very similar to my shadow answer, or at least it uses the same words. But let's look at it carefully. If I say that second-hand stores sell high-quality clothes, then I am kind of saying that buying second-hand clothing, therefore, could be the solution to the problem of microfiber pollution or waste clothing. So it is kind of what I had in mind when I started answering this question. So it looks pretty good. Let's keep it. Option 4 says clothes were not thrown and burnt in landfills. Looks like a good option. It does counter some of the facts that the author has established right at the beginning of the passage. But option 4 is saying that there is no problem really. It doesn't really talk about the solution to the problem. What we have to really counter or weaken is the author's proposed solution. Our job is not to say that there is no problem. Our job is to say that if this is the problem, then this is not really the solution. So while option 4 might look like a very attractive one, it doesn't really match our shadow answer, nor does it really have the logic that is asked of us. So let's eliminate it. Option 3 is the one to pick. Now this is the one that you might have to think about a little bit further as compared to the other questions in this passage. But apart from this, the rest of it is pretty simple. This question says, based on the passage, we can infer that the opposite of fast fashion, slow fashion, would most likely refer to clothes that. This does not really require too much of an inference on our part. Let's just refer to the slow and the fast fashion bit first. In paragraph 1, the author has established that Oxfam is encouraging people to shop local as an alternative to fast fashion brands such as Primark and Boohoo. Now, it doesn't really explain what fast fashion brands is, but later on, we come to know that the author is kind of against the idea of discarding clothing. And at the end, the author is saying that we need to probably buy clothes that last longer. So based on what we have read so far, our understanding should be that fast fashion refers to clothes that are likely to be discarded or thrown away quickly. So what would slow fashion be? Obviously clothes which are not likely to be discarded quickly. Let's now take a look at our options. The first option says are of high quality and long lasting. This is kind of obvious to us, but let's still look at the other options. Do not shed microfibers. Well, We are talking about fast versus slow. We're not really talking about shedding here. So if fast fashion is clothes which only serve their purpose for a short time, then we are looking at the long-lasting nature of the clothes. It's not how much it sheds. So let's eliminate the second option. Option 3 says, do not bleed toxins and dyes. Again, this really does not deal with the fast versus slow fashion angle. So let's eliminate it. Option 4 says, are sold by genuine vintage stores. Well, genuine vintage stores might be stores that sell good items or good quality vintage items. But again, it does not necessarily establish that these clothes are going to be long lasting. So option 4 cannot be our answer. So as I said, this question is pretty simple. Our answer should be option 1. This question looks like a specific detail question. Even though it has an except at the end, it's fairly easy to do and shouldn't take you too long. According to the author, companies like ThreadUp have not caught on in the UK for all of the following reasons except. The reason it doesn't take too long is that we just have to refer to the last paragraph. So let's do that now. All that I've done is that I have separated each sentence so that we can refer to each one easily. The first option here says that luxury brands want to maintain their brand image. Well, that is clearly stated not only the first sentence but also in the last one. In the last sentence, it says very clearly that high-end retailers would rather put brand before sustainability. So clearly, the first option contributes to ThreadUp or companies like ThreadUp not being very popular in the UK because they don't really want to sell their clothes all over the globe at a very cheap rate. So, since it's an except question, option 1 cannot be our answer. Option 2 says the British don't buy second-hand clothing. I think this is very easy to see as an exception because in the passage in other places, we have established that vintage stores are becoming very popular, that thrifting is becoming trendy. So, it's not as if the British don't buy second-hand clothing. But here also in paragraph 5, it clearly says in the second sentence that there will always be a market for consignment, which in this case refers to second-hand clothing. So option 2 is not in accordance with the passage, and this is definitely not one of the reasons why ThreadUp and similar companies have not caught on in the UK. Let's keep this. Option 3 says luxury brands do not like their product to be devalued, clearly stated. Luxury brands would rather not circulate their latest season stock around the globe to be sold at a cheaper price. So option 3 must be eliminated. Option 4 says recycling is currently not financially attractive for luxury brands. Now this has been mentioned in the last sentence here. Unless recycling becomes cost effective and filters into mass production, high-end retailers would rather put brand before sustainability. So recycling is not financially attractive yet. Let's eliminate option 4 as well. So it will have to be option 2 because the passage clearly established that the British do buy second-hand clothing. So now that we've eliminated all the other options, we'll have to go back to option 2. We've already established that the British do buy second-hand clothing, so this cannot be one of the reasons that brands or companies like ThreadUp have not become popular in the UK. So since it's an exception, it must be an answer. Here we have a pretty simple question. Now, it is only challenging if you do not understand the meaning of the word ironic. But I think it's a pretty common word, so that should not be too much of a challenge. The question says, the act of thrifting as described in the passage can be considered ironic because it. First, let's understand what thrifting is. So in paragraph 3, it seems that thrifting has increasingly become a trendy practice. What is thrifting? Buying second-hand clothing. And thrift means that you are saving money or resources by buying second-hand clothes. But in paragraph 4, we are clearly saying that this may not really be very helpful because older clothes shed more microfibers and therefore contribute to microfiber pollution. So what is the irony here? The irony is that according to us, thrifting is good for the environment, but actually it might be bad for the environment. Now, let's come to the word irony. Irony normally means a situation where the opposite of the expected happens. So it's some sort of a contradiction, and we see the contradiction happening right here. Thrifting is supposed to help, but ends up worsening the situation. So let's look at our options now. It is an anti-consumerist attitude. Well, this doesn't really refer to the irony involved in this situation. It is not about the consumer, it's about the environment. So option 1 is irrelevant. Option 2 says is not cost effective for retailers. Might be so, but this is not the irony involved in thrifting. The irony has to do with trying to help the environment, but ending up causing damage to it. So option 2 is also irrelevant. Option 3 says has created environmental problems, which is exactly what we had in mind. So let's keep option 3. Option 4 says offers luxury clothing at cut rate prices. First of all, this is not necessarily true. Thrifting just involves buying second-hand clothes. It's not only about luxury clothing. And even if this were true, it would still not really be ironic. So let's eliminate option 4. Option 3 is definitely our answer. Very simple question. This passage appears to be scary, but is actually fairly simple. The reason it appears to be scary is that it talks about history, and many of us are averse to historical passages. The other part is that it uses a few words right at the beginning which are a little off-putting. For example, the positivists. But when you read the first paragraph, you realize that the argument being made is fairly simple, and the same argument more or less is being continued throughout. So let's first take a look at the first paragraph. The positivists, anxious to stake out their claim for history as a science, contributed the weight of their influence to the cult of facts. Complicated sentence. First ascertain the facts, said the positivists, then draw your conclusions from them. So by the time you get to the second sentence, you start figuring out things. This is what may be called the common sense view of history. So the first para is talking about the common sense view of history. It talks about the importance of historical facts. And overall, this paragraph is trying to tell us that there are some people who believe that history is primarily a body of evidence. It is a set of historical facts which does not really involve too much interpretation, or rather, it should not involve too much interpretation. But in the first paragraph itself, the author does give us a hint of what is to come later. So look at the last 3 lines here. It says, Sir George Clarke contrasted the hardcore of facts in history with the surrounding pulp of disputable interpretation, forgetting perhaps that the pulpy part of the fruit is more rewarding than the hardcore. So the author is indicating here that it is the interpretation perhaps that might be more important and not just the facts themselves. So there is a very subtle hint here, but by the time we get to paragraph 2, the author is fairly clear in what he or she wants to say. So let's look at the second para. Now here we are saying, what is a historical fact? According to the common sense view, there are certain basic facts which are the same for all historians and which form the backbone of history. So we are defining the common sense view, fairly easy to understand so far. But this view calls for 2 observations. And we have seen in the past that whenever there is a but, however, this is the more important point. So the author is saying that yes, facts are important. And of course, we do need to get our facts right. But that is not the main function of a historian. So what exactly is the main function? Perhaps the author is going to explain a little bit later. But in this paragraph, all that we're really trying to say is that historical accuracy is a prerequisite. It is not the essential function of a historian. Now, how do we know this? Look at the part where it talks about a historian versus an architect. We would not really praise an architect for using well-seasoned timber or properly mixed concrete. We would expect that at the very least. So, historical accuracy is the least that we can expect of a historian. So, a historian's job is more than that. Now, the next paragraph tells us what more. Now, in the third and the last paragraph, we are saying that the second observation is that the necessity to establish these facts rests not on any quality of the facts themselves, but on an a priori decision of the historian. Again, sounds like a complicated sentence. But as you read further, what the author is really trying to say is that the facts don't really speak for themselves. We have this belief that facts are objective truths, that they exist independent of the historian. But that is not necessarily true, and the author explains why that is not necessarily true. When we realize, for example, that a particular battle was fought in a particular year, why do we know this as a historical fact? It is probably because some historian at some point of time decided that it is important for us to know it. There might have been 1,000 other battles fought around the same time, but we don't know about them because the historians decided it was not important. So the point that is being made in the third paragraph is that historical facts are not objective and independent pieces of information. They are actually subject to interpretation. In fact, historians are necessarily selective. It is they who decide what is an important fact and therefore must be a part of history, and what is not too important and therefore might be omitted from history. So what we have said overall is historical facts and how they might be important or unimportant. Let's do a very quick recap because it's a very short passage, and then we'll go to the questions. So if you recall, in the first paragraph, we said that the view of history as a science emphasizes that it is very important to establish historical facts. Then we said that while historical accuracy is important, it is not the main function of a historian. It is the very least that we can expect from them. So what exactly is the main function of a historian? Apparently, it is interpretation. So in the third paragraph, we are saying that the facts do not really speak for themselves. It is the historian who selects and arranges these facts to build a view of history. So in the end, what we need to understand is that, contrary to what many believe, for example, the positivists, the common sense view of history, historical facts are not objective truths. They are actually selectively interpreted by historians. As I said, very short and sweet passage. You just need to figure out the main idea. Now this question seems lengthy, but as I said, fairly simple. If the author of the passage were to write a book on the Battle of Hastings along the lines of his or her own reasoning, the focus of the historical account would be on. This clearly has to do with the main idea of the passage. That is why it refers to the author's reasoning. So the answer to this actually lies in paragraph 2. So I will just put it out there on the screen. But it is a good idea to paraphrase the author's reasoning for ourselves. The author believes that the historian's essential function is not to establish the facts, but to maybe interpret them, arrange them, build the context around those facts. So this is the approach that the author is most likely to take. Now let's take a look at our first option. Exploring the socio-political and economic factors that led to the battle. This refers to the context for the Battle of Hastings. So this could possibly be a path that the author takes. This is not mere establishment of facts, but interpreting the facts to build a larger picture. So let's keep option 1. Option 2 says providing a nuanced interpretation by relying on the auxiliary sciences. Now this was an option that I fell for initially, and then of course I was stuck between two options and I realized that there is something wrong with option 2. The first part of this option says providing a nuanced interpretation, and this might catch you off guard because yes, the author does believe that history is about interpretation, but look at the rest of it. By relying on the auxiliary sciences, this part is not correct. If you look at paragraph 2, why does the historian rely on the auxiliary sciences? To establish historical accuracy. The auxiliary sciences do not help with interpretation. So it is for this reason that option 2 must be eliminated. Interpretation, yes. Auxiliary sciences, no. This is not the method that the author would have used. Now, option 3 says deriving historical facts from the relevant documents and inscriptions. This would again support the common sense view, the positivist view, but definitely not the author's view. So let's eliminate the third one. The fourth option says producing a detailed timeline of the various events that led to the battle. A detailed timeline would be equal to establishing historical accuracy or merely deriving historical facts. It does not really involve any sort of interpretation. So option 4 again does not represent what the author thinks is the historian's essential function. So we should eliminate it. It would have to be option 1. Now this question is fairly easy provided you understand the common sense view. All of the following describe the common sense view of history except. There is an except, but it doesn't really take too much time to solve this question. Our first option says real history can be found in ancient engravings and archival documents. Is this the common sense view? Well, let's refer to paragraph 1. We have said that the positivists looked upon history as a science. They felt that history therefore should be a body of historical facts. First ascertain the facts, said the positivists, then draw your conclusions from them. And how do we establish these facts? By looking at documents, ancient inscriptions, and so on. So option 1 represents the common sense view and therefore cannot be our answer because we're looking for an exception. Option 2 says history is like science, a selective system of cognitive orientations to reality. If you don't refer to the text, you might fall for this option as a trap. History is like a science. This is something that the positivists were trying to prove. But let's look at where the statement has been made in the passage. In paragraph 4, it is Professor Talcott Parsons who has made this statement. But look at the second half of this option. A selective system of cognitive orientations to reality. According to the common sense view, history is a body of objective facts. There is no need for the historian to be selective. In fact, the historian doesn't need to do anything with those facts. But when we say that history is like science in the sense that it is a selective system, that is the opposite of the common sense view. So, option 2 could be our exception. The third option says only the positivist methods can lead to credible historical knowledge. Now, if you look at the first paragraph, clearly the common sense view is in agreement with what the positivists were saying. The positivists were very anxious to claim history as a science and therefore were very fact-oriented. And the common sense view is also very fact-oriented. So option 3 represents the common sense view. Let's eliminate that. Option 4 says history can be objective like the sciences if it is derived from historical facts. Again, paragraph 1 clearly establishes this as the common sense view, which is in agreement with the positivist view. So our answer therefore will have to be option 2 because we've eliminated all the rest. Fairly simple question. This question says, according to this passage, which one of the following statements best describes the significance of archaeology for historians? This is a specific detail question. We just have to go back to check what archaeology does for historians. If you look at paragraph 2, it says, it is a necessary condition of his work. Now, what does this it refer to? Establishing historical facts is a necessary condition for the historian's work, but it is not the essential function. It is a prerequisite, but it is not limited to that. And it is to establish these historical facts that the historian has to look at these auxiliary sciences, for example, archaeology, epigraphy, numismatics, and so on. So now we have kind of understood what is the significance of archaeology. Archaeology helps to establish historical facts. So now the first option says the same thing. Archaeology helps historians to interpret historical facts. But look at the word interpret. Is this what we are really looking for? Not really. So be very careful, read every word, eliminate option 1 because it says interpret rather than establish. Now option 2 says archaeology helps historians to carry out their primary duty. What is the historian's primary duty according to the author? It is not establishing facts. It is interpreting those facts, selecting them, and building a context around those facts. So archaeology does not help them carry out the primary duty. Let's eliminate option 2. The third one says archaeology helps historians to locate the oldest civilizations in history. This is a common sense option. If you don't read the passage, this is probably what you would have picked. But this is not what the passage states. So let's eliminate option 3. Option 4 says archaeology helps historians to ascertain factual accuracy. In other words, it helps them establish historical facts. And that is exactly what the passage also tells us. So option 4 is our answer. Here we have a somewhat complicated reasoning question. But if you simplify the question stem, then it becomes a fairly easy question. Let's first simplify. All of the following, if true, can weaken the passage's claim that facts do not speak for themselves except. When I see this question, I just see too many negatives and it is difficult for our brains to process so much negative information. So why not remove the negatives? Let's cancel out the not and the except and see what happens. What we get then is which of the following will weaken the claim that facts speak for themselves. We are still weakening the argument. It's just that instead of the negation, we are trying to look at a positive argument. So I hope you've understood how we have done that. We've just cancelled out the not and the except and we have kept the remaining text. So please keep in mind that now we are trying to weaken the claim that facts speak for themselves. So let's come up with a shadow answer that brings some further clarity. What we really want is to establish that facts are not necessarily objective. How do I get this? When we say the facts speak for themselves, it means that it is objective information. I don't really have to add anything to it. When we try to weaken that, facts speak for themselves, we are trying to say that the facts are not objective, that they are subject to interpretation. Let's keep this in mind. Let us only refer to the shadow answer while eliminating options. The truth value of a fact is independent of the historian who expresses it. In other words, the fact is objective. This is not what we are looking for. We want to say facts are not objective, they are subject to interpretation. Let's eliminate the first option. Option 2 says A fact by its very nature is objective and universal. We can pretty much stop here because we want the opposite of this. Option 3 says the order in which a series of facts is presented does not have any bearing on the production of meaning. It might take you a while to maybe process this option, but in very simplified terms, this is also trying to say that interpretation or arrangement of facts will not significantly change the meaning. In other words, facts speak for themselves. So let's eliminate the third option. Option 4 says facts, like truth, can be relative. And here we should be fairly confident that we have found the answer. What is fact for person X may not be so for person Y. In other words, facts do not speak for themselves. So option 4 becomes our answer. We have a fairly easy passage here. And out of the 4 questions, I think that 3 are definitely doable with a fair degree of confidence as well. So there's very little ambiguity that we have to deal with. Now, the first 2 paragraphs are a little misleading in the sense that it may not really tell you outright what the topic is. We do know that the first paragraph talks about translation. So you would start off thinking that maybe it's going to talk about the importance of translation. But then it starts talking about Netflix and other deep-pocketed global firms. So let's take a look at the first paragraph. It does not really come to the main point. It just about builds the background and then leads to the main point somewhere around paragraph 2. So the first paragraph is simply establishing that translation is a big deal in Europe. And the first line is actually pretty beautiful, so I would like to read it out. Umberto Eco, an Italian writer, was right when he said the language of Europe is translation. What this means is that in Europe, different countries obviously speak different languages. So what is the common language? What is it that allows one country to understand the people of another country? It's translation. And it's saying that Netflix is speaking the language of translation. In other words, it is now translating content into multiple languages so that people from different countries can view that content and understand it. And it uses both dubbing and subtitling to do it. In paragraph 2, it is specifically talking about how a lot of European productions, therefore, have become appealing to American audiences. It takes the example of one particular show called Lupin. It's a crime show which has become a global hit because it was translated into English. And then it says that Netflix also has a lot of productions underway in Europe, which is more than big public broadcasters in France or Germany. So if I look at it, the 2 things that stand out from the first 2 paragraphs are translation and Netflix in Europe. So that is what I'm going to say the topic is. The author tries to bring about the point here that Netflix has expanded its reach within Europe by translating in terms of both dubbing and subtitling. And on the other hand, it has also made American audiences a lot more receptive to European content. Let's move on to paragraph 3. Now here we are saying that yes, everything is fine, but not all the content works across borders. Comedy sometimes struggles, and I think this is fairly easy for us to understand because comedy is very specific to a culture. So if you translate it, you might miss out on some of those specific cultural references and, the joke will be lost. So that makes sense. Whodunits and bloodthirsty maelstorms between arch-Romans and uppity tribesmen have a more universal appeal. This line is a little difficult to understand, but a whodunit is nothing but a mystery. And bloodthirsty maelstrom obviously refers to something which involves war and fighting. So these things have a global appeal and generally people like these shows across borders. Now as we read through this paragraph, it is trying to tell us that some content is popular, other content is not popular. For example, German TV is not made for export, someone says very politely. So German TV shows may not really make the cut in other countries. A bigger problem is that national broadcasters still dominate. So if we kind of look at what is happening in India, for example, a lot of us, of course, watch shows on Netflix. But there is still a pretty large audience for television. And since Europe is an aging continent, there would be a lot of people who probably don't watch too many things on Netflix. They are still probably looking at their own televisions and therefore watching whatever is being broadcast nationally. So here we have said that yes, Netflix has made headway into Europe, but it has not completely converted all the audience. Also because some content is able to cross borders, other content is not as popular in remaining countries. So this is talking about the challenges that Netflix is facing. Now let's take a look at paragraph 4. Here, we are introducing a problem. So some people in Europe are a little concerned and they see Netflix as a cultural hegemon. Now, what is a hegemon? It is someone who dominates. So could we say that because Netflix is curating this content and Netflix is becoming popular in Europe, that it might actually start having a cultural impact to the extent that it might dominate the local culture? This is what some people are worried about in Europe. Then it says that on the whole, Netflix does not have shows. I mean, if you look at the Netflix original content, it does not really have shows with very specific cultural references. And this is another worrying trend because people are keen on preserving their local culture. So in this paragraph, we are simply saying that Netflix might be seen as a threat by some European countries, not only because of the type of content that it presents, but also because decision making within Netflix is still primarily American. I mean, the top executives are still in America, even though it does have offices in Europe. Paragraph 5 starts off with the words "they should not be." They should not be refers to European politicians who are concerned about what Netflix is doing to Europe in terms of maybe dominating the local culture. But the author is taking a side here. The author is saying they should not really be worried because on the whole, Netflix is doing something very nice for them. An irony of European integration is that it is often American companies that facilitate it. It's trying to say that American companies have brought Europe closer together. In the past, Google Translate has done it, and now Netflix is doing something very similar. So the Europeans have shared vaccines, they have shared many other things. Now they're just sharing the kind of stuff that they watch on their phones. So in a way, it gives them some common ground. So the argument that the author is making, and this is actually where the author brings about the argument, is that Netflix, like many other American companies, is contributing to European integration, not only by facilitating cultural sharing, but also giving Europeans something in common. Let's do a very quick recap before we look at the questions. In the first paragraph, we simply said that Netflix has expanded its reach within Europe and also that European productions are now appealing to Americans. Then we said that in certain cases, there is cross-border appeal in terms of content, but in certain others, not really. Another challenge that Netflix is facing is that it has to compete with the national broadcasters. Then we said that European politicians actually see Netflix as a bit of a threat to their culture. But in the very next paragraph, the author says that they should not really be concerned because Netflix is actually contributing to European integration. So on the whole, in this passage, if I have to search for the main idea typically is not a simple statement of fact. So now, if we start thinking about what the main idea is, the main idea usually is not just a simple statement of fact or an observation. A lot of times it is a recommendation or a suggestion. In this case, it is an opinion. So the author is trying to say that instead of Netflix being seen as a threat to culture, Europeans should look upon it as a positive force because it is actually contributing to European integration. Now that we've understood the passage, let's take a look at the questions. The first question here says, based only on information provided in the passage, which one of the following hypothetical Netflix shows would be the most successful with audiences across the EU? This is an application question, but it's a very easy application question based on a very specific detail in the passage. We have to look at paragraph 3 to answer this. Now in paragraph 3, it talks about what content works across borders and what content doesn't. So we clearly know that comedy struggles, whodunits, which are mysteries, and bloodthirsty maelstorms do much better. German television is not built for export. So these are the points we need to look at in answering this question. Let's look at the first option here. An original German TV science fiction production. Well, it clearly says that German TV content is not good for export. In other words, it is not likely to be successful with audiences beyond Germany. So option 1 cannot be our answer. Option 2 says an Italian comedy show hosted by an international star. Regardless of who hosts it, the passage clearly tells us that comedy struggles across borders. So option 2 cannot be our answer. Option 3 says a murder mystery drama set in North Africa and France. A murder mystery is equal to a whodunit. This is likely to work across borders, so let's keep option 3. Option 4 says a transatlantic romantic drama set in Europe and America. Now the passage is kind of silent on whether a romantic drama will work. So I can't really be very sure about option 4. But since the question is asking me which of the following would be the most successful, and I definitely have evidence for option 3, I will say, why make life complicated? Let's eliminate option 4 and select option 3 as the answer. This is a very simple question. The author sees the rise of Netflix in Europe as. So yes, we do need to understand the author's view, but that's not very complicated because the author has explicitly stated it in the passage. If you look at paragraph 5, the author says they, which means the European politicians, should not be nervous. Why? Because Netflix is actually a positive force. It is helping with European integration. So this is the author's view. Now let's try to match that to one of the options. Does the author see it as an economic threat? Not really. That has not been given to us in the passage. And in fact, nowhere in the passage does it mention that anyone sees Netflix as an economic threat. There are some who see it as a threat to their local culture. So option 1 is beyond the scope of the passage. Option 2 says a unifying force. So when the author has said very clearly that Netflix and Friends pump the same content into homes across the continent, it makes culture a cross-border endeavor too, which means it is unifying people. So option 2 could be our answer. Option 3 says a looming cultural threat. This is not the author's view. This is what some people in Europe or some politicians feel. So option 3 can be eliminated. Option 4 says filling an entertainment gap. First of all, it does not really mention that there is a gap anywhere in the passage. Plus, this is not really the author's view. So option 4 is easy to eliminate. As I said, a very simple question. The answer is option 2. Here we have a specific detailed question. There is an except at the end, but it really doesn't take too long to answer this one. Based on the information provided in the passage, all of the following are true except. So I hope you notice the except. We need to pick something that is not supported by the passage. Let's look at our first option. National broadcasters dominate in the EU in terms of total television viewing hours. This is kind of true. If you look at paragraph 3, it clearly says a bigger problem is that national broadcasters still dominate. Streaming services account for about a third of all the viewing hours. So clearly the remaining 2/3 is these national broadcasters. So option 1 is supported by the passage. It cannot be our answer. Option 2 says only half of Netflix's original programming in the EU is now produced in America. This is also explicitly supported by paragraph 1. It says very clearly that in 2015, about 75% of Netflix's original content was American. Now the figure is half. So we don't really need to read any further. Option 2 cannot be our answer. We're looking for an exception. Option 3 says that Netflix has been able to transform itself into a truly European entity. Now, if you don't really read the passage, you might say that this is true. But if you look at it carefully, the passage tells you that yes, in terms of content, Netflix has diversified, but the decision making is still American. So paragraph 4 says that Netflix has offices across Europe, but ultimately the big decisions rest with American executives. So Netflix is still not really a European company, which means that option 3 could be our exception. Let's keep it. Option 4 says that European television productions have the potential to become global hits. If we go back to paragraph 1, it says that American audiences are more willing than before to give dubbed or subtitled viewing a chance. And then it quotes the example of Lupin to say how a French show has actually become very popular. So we have enough evidence to support the idea that European television productions have the potential to become global hits. So option 4 is not an exception. Let's eliminate it. Option 3 becomes our answer because we clearly know that decision-making at Netflix is still American, which is why it is not a European entity yet. Here we have a reasoning question, but it's not a very complicated reasoning question. Now, if I were given a choice, I would always prefer a strengthened question over a weakened question. I don't know why it is so complicated, but it is. In this case, we first need to understand what the author's conclusion is in the final paragraph, and then we have to weaken that conclusion. Now here, if I did not understand what the author is trying to say in the final paragraph, I might not do this question at all. But we've already gone through it. It's not very complicated. In paragraph 5, all that the author is really trying to say is that Netflix actually contributes to European integration. Now, if I have to try to weaken it, I would say that by pumping content into various European countries, Netflix may not be helping European integration or something resembling that. Let's now look at our first option. Now here, we are saying that research shows there is wide variance in the popularity and viewing of Netflix shows across different EU countries. This tells us that the contention that Netflix is providing similar content across different European countries is not necessarily true. So, there is really no common ground that it is building because people in different countries are watching very different things. And that is why the author's argument is weakened. So, the basis for the author's argument was similar content means cultural sharing, which means greater unity. But if the content is not similar, then there is no cultural integration and therefore the author's argument is weakened. So, let's keep the first option. Option 2 says that Netflix hits produced in France are very popular with North American audiences. Now, the author is talking about European integration. The last paragraph does not really say much about America and whether European productions have appeal in the US. That is something that has been discussed in a completely different paragraph. So, option 2 is not really relevant to the argument. We need to eliminate it. Option 3 says that older women across the EU enjoy watching romantic comedies on Netflix, whereas younger women prefer historical fiction dramas. But what this is trying to still establish is that within a certain demographic, there is common ground across countries. So, older women across EU prefer certain kinds of content and younger women prefer other kinds of content. But this would probably add to the author's argument and definitely not weaken it. So, let's eliminate option 3. Option 4 says that research shows that Netflix has been gradually losing market share to other streaming television service providers. But this option does not really affect our argument. It doesn't tell us whether Netflix is bringing people together or driving them apart. It just says that Netflix is probably losing popularity, but again, irrelevant to the argument under consideration. So, option 4 should be eliminated. Option 1 definitely is our answer. Might have required a little more thought than the other questions, but not a question that you're going to get wrong. On the whole, definitely solvable. Let's try to tackle a more challenging passage. Now, there are two challenges that this passage presents. First is the topic. It talks about liberalism, so if you're not very well read or you have never encountered this word earlier, it is going to present some difficulties. Secondly, it does have slightly more complex language as well, so you might struggle on both of these aspects. Nevertheless, let's talk about the questions. Now, a lot of times we feel that a difficult passage will have easy questions and vice versa. I find that in this case, it's not entirely true. Some of the questions are also a little bit challenging. So in this passage, I might not want to do all the questions, and out of the 3 that I might do, I may not get all of them right. Nevertheless, let's get started with the passage first, and then we'll see what happens. In the first paragraph, we are saying that liberalism has been very successful, but that now we have a view, particularly Mr. Patrick Deneen's view, that liberalism is on the decline. It says that it is destroyed by a mix of hubris and internal contradictions, according to Patrick Deneen, a professor of politics. So this passage is not necessarily the author's view, it is Mr. Deneen's view. In passages like this, you have to be a little careful because at some point of time, the author might also present his or her own views. So you should be able to clearly distinguish between the two. In the first paragraph, the author is merely saying that there is this book that Mr. Deneen has probably written, and in this book, Mr. Deneen is saying that liberalism is on the decline, and then it talks about all the problems that are happening because of that. So the topic is fairly easy to figure out. Patrick Deneen's views on the disintegration of liberalism. Now, when we look at the end, it says, what better proof of this than the vision of 1,000 private planes whisking their occupants to Davos to discuss the question of creating a shared future in a fragmented world. This is a sentence that may not make sense to a lot of us, but on the whole, what is being said here is that there are some people in today's world who are obviously very privileged. These are the people who are traveling to Davos in private planes. But why are they going there? So that they can discuss a shared future in a fragmented world, which is a little ironic because on the one hand, you're enjoying a privileged life, and on the other, you're talking about how you want to create a shared future with all the others who are less privileged. So what we learn from this paragraph is how Mr. Deneen feels about liberalism. We don't know how the author feels about it. So let's try to sum that up now. Mr. Deneen is saying that liberalism, after many, many decades or even centuries of success, is on the decline due to internal contradictions and pride. So hubris means pride, which leads to or which has led to many societal issues. Now, some of these issues have been pointed out in this paragraph. For example, it talks about how equality of opportunity has actually produced a new meritocratic aristocracy. In other words, there is a new elite class which is a little unconcerned about the rest of the people. It has also talked about how democracy has degenerated into a theater of the absurd. So democracy has also been on the decline and so on. What I thought was that if you have some idea of what liberalism actually means or promises, then this paragraph is very easy to understand. But if on the other hand, you're not very familiar with it, then I would agree that this is going to present a significant challenge. So this is the least that we need to take out from the first paragraph, that liberalism is on the decline according to Mr. Deneen. Let's now move on to the second paragraph. Now here, the author is reviewing Mr. Deneen's work. Deneen does an impressive job of capturing the current mood of disillusionment, echoing left-wing complaints about rampant commercialism, right-wing complaints about narcissistic and bullying students. At this point, some of us might get lost and think, I'm not really sure what this is saying. But let's go back to the first line. What we need to understand is that the author is commending Mr. Deneen on something. He has done an impressive job capturing the current mood of disillusionment. So he has captured the unhappiness that people are feeling with regard to liberalism and its consequences. After that, it says that while this has been well done, Mr. Deneen has not really concluded correctly. But when he concludes that all this adds up to a failure of liberalism, is his argument convincing? So the author seems to say that I agree with Mr. Deneen to some extent, but I don't agree with his conclusion. I don't agree with the fact that liberalism has failed. And why does the author not agree? That is the second half of this paragraph. He argues that the essence of liberalism lies in freeing individuals from constraints. In fact, liberalism contains a wide range of intellectual traditions which provide different answers. So, according to Mr. Deneen, liberalism is simply reduced to individual freedom. But the author is saying that in saying so, Mr. Deneen has disregarded the fact that liberalism is a little more wide-ranging. It is not only about individual freedom. In fact, it encompasses or includes a pretty wide range of perspectives that talk not only about individual freedom, but balancing that freedom with responsibility. So, the author has reached some sort of a mixed review here. Mr. Deneen is right in one respect, but he's not really right in another. Now, let's try to sum that up. Here, obviously, we are talking about Mr. Deneen's viewpoint and the author's views on Mr. Deneen's viewpoint. So, Deneen's argument that current trends signal the failure of liberalism is not very convincing because liberalism in the past, in general, has always included a pretty wide range of viewpoints. Let's now look at the next paragraph. Now, in this, Mr. Deneen's fixation on the essence of liberalism leads to the second big problem of this book. In the previous paragraph, also, the author had pointed to something that he does not agree with. Here also, the author is saying that there is a second problem in the book. His failure to recognize liberalism's ability to reform itself and address its internal problems. So if you remember, Mr. Patrick Deneen is basically saying that liberalism is failing and that it's pretty much finished. The author is saying that's not true because you have overlooked certain features of liberalism. The fact that it is not only about individual freedom. And here the author is saying that Mr. Deneen has overlooked a second feature of liberalism, the fact that it has self-corrected in the past. And then the author provides some evidence to support this viewpoint. The late 19th century saw America suffering from many of the problems that are reappearing today. So we have seen this happening in the past. So what happened? Did liberalism die? No. There were a lot of liberals who in fact corrected these problems. Now look at the last sentence. Rather than dying, liberalism reformed itself. So again, the author is saying that we cannot therefore be convinced that liberalism is at an end. It is probably still too early to believe that reform is impossible. So let's try to sum up the argument in this paragraph. The author is trying to say that Mr. Deneen has overlooked liberalism's capacity for self-reform. In this last paragraph, again, the author is providing a mixed report. The author says that Mr. Deneen is right to point out that the record of liberalism in recent years has been dismal. After that, however, the author again says, nevertheless, we cannot conclude that liberalism is dead or is about to die. Now let's look at the last sentence. The best way to read why liberalism failed is not as a funeral oration, but as a call to action. Up your game or else. So the author is saying that this book points out the fact that there is a need for reform, but we cannot really be convinced that liberalism is dead. So let's try to sum up the argument. The author is trying to tell us that Mr. Deneen is wrong to argue that liberalism is dead, that abandoning liberalism is what we need to do. In fact, we need to read this book as a call to action that liberalism needs to improve and reform itself, and otherwise, perhaps it might in fact die. So this entire passage is a review of Mr. Deneen's work. Again, as I said at the beginning, if you are familiar with the topic, it's not very difficult. If you are unfamiliar, the same passage will become more challenging, which is why people have very different views about this one. According to us, this passage is of moderate difficulty. We would expect you to be well read enough to be familiar with these notions that are being presented in this passage. Let's do a really quick passage recap. It will help us answer the questions because a lot of the questions deal with the authors agreeing or disagreeing with certain aspects. So in the first paragraph, we said that Mr. Patrick Deneen has written a book, and in this book, he argues that liberalism, after many years of success, is disintegrating. Then we said that Deneen's argument that current trends signal the failure of liberalism is not entirely convincing because he does not take into account the fact that liberalism actually encompasses very different perspectives on balancing individual freedom with responsibility. Then we pointed to another flaw, that Mr. Deneen overlooks liberalism's historical capacity for self-reform. So according to Mr. Deneen, liberalism is going to die. According to the author, that's not entirely true. And in the last paragraph, the author again concludes by saying that Mr. Deneen is right to an extent, but he is wrong to say that we need to abandon liberalism. Instead of that, we need to look at this book as a need for corrective action. So overall, in a passage like this, are we supposed to focus on the author's view or Mr. Deneen's view? We have to understand what the purpose of this passage is. The purpose of this passage is to review Mr. Deneen's book. Therefore, we should be focusing on the author's view rather than Mr. Deneen's view. So let's do that. The main idea here is going to be that Mr. Patrick Deneen captures the disillusionment with liberalism well, but according to the author, liberalism should not be seen as being beyond repair because historically it has been able to take corrective action. So in this main idea, obviously we have focused on the author's view and not only Mr. Deneen's view. Let's now take a look at our questions. This question here, according to me, is pretty difficult because you have to truly understand liberalism as a concept to answer this. It says, all of the following statements are evidence of the decline of liberalism today except. So added to that is the word except, which makes it even more complicated. The reason that I'm saying that it's a challenging question is that you cannot simply refer to the passage and get to the answer. You cannot even infer some of these aspects from the passage unless you think about it pretty deeply. Let's get started. The first option says, the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies. Is this evidence of decline of liberalism? Well, this is clearly mentioned in the text, but we also have to take note of the fact that it should not only be mentioned, but should be mentioned as evidence. So if you look at the third paragraph, it clearly says that we are now witnessing problems that we have seen in 19th century America. It says the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies. And then in this context, if you remember, the author mentions that when these problems arose, people took corrective action. So clearly, these are evidence for the decline of liberalism. So the first option cannot be an exception. It is definitely evidence of decline. So let's eliminate it. Now let's look at the second one. Democracy has degenerated into a theater of the absurd. Now, whenever we talk about democracy, a lot of times we say liberal democracy because those two are kind of connected. How they are connected, I will not be able to explain right now, but let's take a look at how this statement appears in the passage. In paragraph 1, we have said, now it is disintegrating, destroyed by a mix of hubris and internal contradictions. And then it says, democracy has degenerated into a theatre of the absurd. If I combine this statement with some further evidence in paragraph 3, then I can probably conclude that this is evidence of decline. So look at paragraph 3. There also, it talks about the corruption of politics. And when I say that democracy has degenerated into a theatre of the absurd, clearly that also says that politics or the political process has been corrupted. So option 2 is definitely not an exception. Let's eliminate it. Option 3 is where I struggled a little bit. The gap between liberalism's claims about itself and the lived reality of the citizenry is now so wide that the lie can no longer be accepted. Complicated sentence. So let's simplify it. What the author is saying is that liberalism claims that it wants certain ideals to be realized. What are these ideals? Individual freedom, equality of opportunity, things like that. But what has actually happened is that these claims do not meet reality. The reality that people are living is very different from what liberalism has promised. So could I look at it as evidence of decline of liberalism? Yes, I can. So let's take a look at the text. The same sentence has been mentioned in the text right after the point that liberalism is now disintegrating, destroyed by a mix of hubris and internal contradictions. This is a perfect example of a contradiction. So option 3 cannot be an exception. So that leaves only option 4. And technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. The problem is that this is clearly mentioned in the first paragraph. So is this an exception? We need to think about it a little deeper. The author is asking us about the evidence for the decline of liberalism. Technological advancement may or may not be bad on its own, but it has led to meaningless work for a large or some section of the people. And this is a problem. But is this related to the promise of liberalism? Is it related to individual freedom? Is it related to equality of opportunity? Not directly. And that is why option 4 is not direct evidence for the decline of liberalism. Everything else could be said to be a direct outcome except the fourth option. So, after all of that thinking, we should be able to say that option 4 is probably better than the rest. It's not an easy question, and if I were confused, I would probably not solve this one in the test. But for now, let's confirm option 4 as our answer. Now here we have a question that contains the word except, but it's a very simple question. And for this, you might have to go back to the text a few times. It says the author of the passage faults Deneen's conclusions for all of the following reasons except. So we have to go back and check. Has the author raised an objection to this? Has the author raised an objection to this? And so on. The first option here says, its failure to note historical instances in which the process of declining liberalism has managed to reverse itself. The author has raised this as a point in paragraph 3. Mr. Deneen's fixation on the essence of liberalism leads to the second big problem of the book, his failure to recognize liberalism's ability to reform itself. So clearly, this is criticism that the author has directed towards Mr. Deneen's work. So it's not an exception, let's eliminate it. Option 2 says it's repeated harking back to pre-modern notions of liberty. This has been mentioned, but not as a flaw. So let's take a look at paragraph 4. The author says that Mr. Deneen is right to assert that the world has much to learn from pre-modern notions. So this is not a problem. This is something that the author actually commends. And that is why option 2 is probably our exception. Let's keep it. Option 3 says it's extreme pessimism about the future of liberalism today. Well, the author has clearly faulted Mr. Deneen on this. In the last paragraph, the author is saying very, very clearly that the best way to read why liberalism failed is not as a funeral oration, but as a call to action. So he does not agree with this extreme pessimism that Mr. Deneen has shown. Let's eliminate the third option. Now the fourth one says, it's very narrow definition of liberalism limited to individual freedoms. This has also been pointed out as a flaw if you look at paragraph 2. He argues that the essence of liberalism lies in freeing individuals from constraints, in other words, individual freedom. But according to the author, liberalism is more wide-ranging than that. So option 4 is also a flaw, therefore not an exception, therefore to be eliminated. So our answer will have to be option 2. Here we have a disagree question which requires us to do some degree of inferencing. Now what we need to pay attention to is that it is asking us for which of the statements the author might disagree with except. So we have a double negative situation. We should cancel out the negatives and simplify the question stem. So that reduces some effort on our part. So if I look at the simplified question stem, it is simply asking us, the author is likely to agree with which of the following statements. So if you have understood the author's argument or viewpoint, then it is not a very difficult question. But if you have skipped this step, then maybe it will take you a little bit more time to solve it. The first option says that the author of the passage is likely to disagree with the fact that claims about liberalism's disintegration are exaggerated and misunderstand its core features. Now remember, the simplified question is, would the author agree with this? Now if we look at the text, the author is saying that Mr. Deneen is right to point out that the record of liberalism in recent years has been dismal. So according to the author, claims about liberalism's disintegration are not exaggerated. In fact, liberalism has been on the decline. So the author would not agree with the first option. Let's eliminate it. Option 2 says, liberalism was a dominant ideal in the past, but it had to reform itself to remain so. Now, this has been clearly mentioned in paragraph 3. In the late 19th century, we saw very similar problems, but instead of dying, liberalism reformed itself. So clearly, the author would agree with this particular sentence. Let's keep it. Now let's take a look at option 3. If we accept that liberalism is a dying ideal, we must work to find a viable or a practical substitute. But the author does not agree that liberalism is dying, and therefore the author does not find the need for a substitute. The best way to read why liberalism failed is not as a funeral oration. This is equal to saying that we have not reached a point where we can say that liberalism is dead. Liberalism historically has reformed itself, so maybe it will do so again. So the author is not going to agree with what is stated in option 3. Let's eliminate option 3. Now option 4 says that the essence of liberalism lies in greater individual self-expression and freedoms. If I look at it in a common sense way, I would say that yes, the author would of course agree with it. But if you look at the passage, then the author will not. In paragraph 2, the author is saying that Mr. Deneen has reduced liberalism to individual freedom or freedom from constraint. But that is not all that liberalism is. And therefore, option 4 is not something that the author would agree with. Let's eliminate option 4. So clearly, option 2 is the only one that has very explicit approval from the author, and that is why it's our answer. This question is a logical structure question and it is challenging. Again, one of those questions where I may not be very sure of my answer. So it asks us, the author of the passage refers to the Davos elite to illustrate his views on what? We need to understand why the Davos elite have been mentioned not just once but twice in the passage, specifically at the end. Let's look at the first paragraph and the fourth one. Now in the first paragraph, we have said that Mr. Deneen writes, what better proof of this than the vision of 1,000 private planes whisking their occupants to Davos? What is this a proof of? It is a proof of the fact that liberalism is on the decline, that what it promises and what it actually provides are very different. Now let's look at paragraph 4. Here the author says that the biggest enemy of liberalism is old-fashioned greed, as members of the Davos elite pile their plates ever higher with perks and share options. So again, we are saying that the Davos elite therefore represent the privileged rich. These are people who are still trying to accumulate wealth while trying to say that we are liberals. So in a way, they have double standards. So my shadow answer will look something like this. The Davos elite have been mentioned to highlight the double standards of the elites who continue to accumulate wealth and enjoy privileged lives while saying that they believe in the liberal doctrine. Now, please understand that the liberal doctrine is not really about some people getting really rich and others remaining poor. It is about equality of opportunity and shared individual freedom. So, while liberalism promises that sort of a world, in reality, we have not really had that world. Let's now look at our options. Now, the first option looks pretty good. The unlikelihood of a return to liberalism of the past. But the Davos elite have not really been mentioned to say that we will not be able to return to liberalism of the past, because on the whole, the author is still pretty hopeful that we might be able to reform ourselves there. So option 1 cannot be our answer. Option 2 says the hypocrisy of the liberal rich, which is pretty close to our shadow answer. The Davos elite are people who profess to be liberals, but on the whole do not really act as if they are. So option 2 should be retained. Option 3 says the way the debate around liberalism has been captured by the rich. So you see, it's not necessarily who has captured the debate. It is the fact that liberalism's promise and reality are very different because of these people who lead very privileged lives. So option 3 cannot be our answer. Option 4 says the fact that the rise in liberalism had led to a greater interest in shared futures from unlikely social classes. First of all, the Davos elite are not genuinely interested in a shared future. That is what the author is trying to point out. They say that they want a shared future, but they don't actually want it. So option 4 does not capture the reason why the Davos elite have been mentioned. In fact, it doesn't get it at all. So let's eliminate the fourth option. It will have to be option 2, and the clue is the word hypocrisy. Let's take a look at this pretty easy para-completion question from the same slot. And the reason that I'm saying that this is easy is that you could solve this in 1 to 2 minutes at most. All you needed to do was to have practiced a few para-completion questions and maybe a few para-jumble questions. Now, first what we do is we read the given sentence to figure out what that sentence is talking about. After that, we read the paragraph, we ignore the blanks just to get a hang of the story. And then we try to see if there is a logical gap anywhere in the paragraph. Sometimes the gap is easy to spot and sometimes it's not. In this case, I think the logical gap is pretty easy to spot, and that is why it's a simple question. So the given sentence says, and probably much earlier, moving the documentation for kissing back 1000 years compared to what was acknowledged in the scientific community. First of all, it's a pretty interesting topic, if nothing else. Secondly, when it says, and probably much earlier, just before this, there has to be some reference to some time frame. Having understood this, now let's take a look at the paragraph. It starts by saying that research has hypothesized that the earliest evidence of human lip kissing originated in a very specific geographical location in South Asia 3500 years ago. So it comments on some research that was there. Then we have the first blank, and right after the blank it says, from there it may have spread. Now, what does this word there refer to? Clearly, this specific geographical location in South Asia. So that tells me that there is no logical gap here. From there, it may have spread to other regions. So from that region, it spread to other regions. We are talking about, in general, some historical evidence of human lip kissing. That much is pretty easy to figure out. Now, as you read through this paragraph, you would find probably that initially it talks about early evidence, then it talks about a new article, and apparently this new article has taken into account some other and different evidence, and it says that kissing was already a well-established practice 4500 years ago in the Middle East. So now, that time when human kissing became a well-established practice has changed. Earlier we thought that the earliest it originated was 3500 years ago. Now we are saying it probably happened much earlier, about 4500 years ago, and so on. And that's all you need to figure out in order for you to answer the question. So we've already seen that in blank 1, there is nothing that we need to put because there is no logical gap. So let's just state that out there. This one is pretty easy to figure out and eliminate. Now let's look at what it says after that. We have now introduced new research by Dr. Troels Spank Arbol and Dr. Sophie Lund Rasmussen, pretty difficult names to pronounce, who in a new article draw on a range of written sources and say that kissing was already a well-established practice 4500 years ago. We have already seen that the given sentence talks about moving the documentation back 1000 years. And if we have some very basic numerical skills, we would say, okay, if I have to compare 4500 and 3500, then this is probably a good spot to put in the given sentence. So I would say that this is a fairly good reason to say that I've got my answer. But we always look at all the blanks because sometimes there might be an even better spot. Let's look at the third one. Now, after blank 2, it talks about the evidence that these new researchers have considered. In ancient Mesopotamia, people wrote in cuneiform script on clay tablets. Before and after blank 2, we're talking about the same clay tablets. So there is no logical gap, which tells me that this is definitely not my answer. Now, let's look at the fourth blank. Just before blank 4, we have said that there were clear examples that kissing was considered a part of romantic intimacy. And after blank 4, it says, but kissing could also have been a part of friendships and family members' relations. So we're talking about two different areas or two different functions that kissing served. So that means that there is no logical gap here also. When we say kissing could also have been a part of friendships, we are just adding to that romantic intimacy angle. That is why it's a very easy question. There can be no doubt that blank number 2 is the spot to put the given sentence. But let's just check always. Now, when we say that kissing was already a well-established practice 4500 years ago in the Middle East and probably much earlier, it means that, okay, by this time it was well-established, but it probably originated much earlier before that. So I found the right spot. Blank 2 must be my answer. Here we have a para-completion question. It looks a little scary, but actually it's pretty easy to solve. So this is one question where you could definitely have earned 3 marks. Let's read the given sentence first, then we will look at the paragraph, try to figure out what the paragraph is about, and then try to fill in the blanks. So the given sentence talks about something called dualism. Dualism was long held as the defining feature of developing countries, in contrast to developed countries where frontier technologies are basically cutting-edge technologies or something which is very advanced, where advanced or frontier technologies and high productivity were assumed to prevail. So we're talking about dualism being a defining feature of developing countries in contrast to developed countries. That is a very simple paraphrase. Now, when we read the paragraph, it says how the concept of dualism was pretty relevant at one point, but then it goes on to say that while this might have made sense in the 1950s and 1960s, it no longer appears to be very relevant today. And why is it not very relevant today? A combination of forces have produced a widening gap between the winners and those left behind. And then it talks about how these disparities or these gaps are only growing. As a result of widening disparities, policymakers in advanced economies are now grappling with the same questions that earlier worried the developing economies. How do we close this gap? So, overall, the thought flow is something like this. There is something called the concept of dualism, which has been explained. Then we said that this concept at one point of time made sense, but now it doesn't really make sense because now there are widening gaps pretty much across the world. And because of these widening gaps, the policymakers are grappling with the same issues that the developing countries did at one point of time. So now that we've read the paragraph, we know that the theme overall is how the idea of productive dualism is no longer relevant. But now, when we start to fill in the blanks, we now need to look for logical continuity between any two given sentences. Let's look at the sentence that is given to us, the one we're supposed to place. When I look at it, it sounds like it could be a starter sentence. But when I read the paragraph, the very first sentence that says at the core of development economics lies the idea of productive dualism in quotes. This tells me that the very first sentence is introducing the idea of productive dualism and it is also defining it. The rest of the paragraph talks about how this concept was applied to differentiate between developing and developed countries. So the given sentence cannot be the starter. The starter will introduce and define the concept of productive dualism, which it is already doing. So let's eliminate the first blank. Now let's look at blank 2. Right after blank 2, we are referring to this distinction between developing and advanced economies. Now let's look at the sentence before that blank. Are we talking about a distinction between developed and developing countries? Not really. We're only talking about developing countries and a split within developing countries. So in order for me to use the sentence after blank 2, I need to talk about some distinction between developing and developed countries. And that is why there is a logical gap. I have to put in the given sentence here because that is where this distinction is explained. So blank 2 looks very promising to me. Let's move on after that because we always check all the blanks. It says after that on the whole, this concept of productive dualism has lost relevance because of widening disparities. Now, if I look at the sentences before and after blank 3, it seems like they're talking about the same thing, the widening disparities and gaps. So there is no logical gap there. The given sentence is not going to fit. So we can eliminate the third blank. Now let's look at the fourth blank. Right after blank 4, it says, as a result, policymakers in advanced economies are now grappling with. So, should I say that dualism was long held as a defining feature of developing countries? Not really. That is a statement that refers to the past. Whereas the statement after blank 4, the as a result statement, talks about the consequences of something happening in the present, which probably refers to the widening disparities. So that tells me that blank 4 is not the right place for the sentence here. Now all I need to do is check whether this given sentence actually fits into blank number 2. Let's check here. We have already said that there is some concept of productive dualism. After that, we have said how dualism was actually a defining feature of developing countries and not there in the case of developed countries. So then we are just talking about this distinction that was being made earlier, and then we're saying this distinction does not apply now. So I can be pretty sure that blank 2 is the right spot. This particular para completion does require a little bit of comprehension, but on the whole, I think there is no ambiguity in this question. So this should definitely get you 3 marks here. Let's take a look at an odd sentence question which has made a comeback in CAT this year. Although it was a bit of a surprise for some students, we did see odd sentence questions for a long time, for nearly a decade, up until CAT 22. Just because it was not there in 1 year, I think it was unfair to say that it would not appear in CAT 23. So let's take a look at our first statement. What we do in odd sentence question is that we try to come up with a short label for every statement. It is nothing but paraphrasing or summarizing that little sentence so that we are able to see the theme. Instead of arranging all the sentences into a para-jumble, which I think takes a lot of time, why not read all the sentences even though they are jumbled up and try to see if you can figure out the topic. So let's do that now. Now the first sentence here clearly talks about the negative outcomes of self-care. So that will be my label. Let's look at the second statement. Now here we are defining latchkey children. These are children who come back from school and then they have to take care of themselves for a long period of time because their parents or other family members are not around. So this is about latchkey children. The third statement kind of is mixed. It says that generally self-care points to negative outcomes, but we don't really have research that considers long-term consequences. So this kind of creates a doubt that self-care is entirely bad. It may not necessarily be bad in the long term because we don't have adequate research on that. So let's just say that. The fourth one says that in research and practice, the phrase children in self-care has come to replace latchkey. So I will simply say that we are now replacing the term latchkey with children in self-care. Finally, we have this. Although parents might believe that self-care would be beneficial for development, recent research has found quite the opposite. So clearly we're talking about the negative outcomes of self-care. I can see here that 1 and 5 are pretty much talking about the same thing, the negative outcomes of self-care. But I have to realize that there is a common theme, right? So what is the common theme here? If I look at 2 and maybe 4, both of them talk about latchkey children. So I would say, okay, the term self-care applies to latchkey children. So maybe I can combine 1, 2, 4 and 5. Now let's look at 3. This is one candidate for the odd one out. It talks about the fact that long-term consequences have not been researched. This is the only sentence that also says that maybe there are not too many negative outcomes. Whereas if you look at all the other statements, more or less they're saying that self-care is not necessarily a good thing for children. So I would probably pick 3 for 2 reasons. 1, I cannot really connect it to other sentences. 2 and 4 and 1 and 5 are better connected. The other point, of course, is that it talks about the lack of research, whereas the other statements clearly talk about adequate research being done on this matter. So my theme is that research shows that self-care leads to negative consequences for children, and that one sentence that kind of goes against this theme therefore becomes my odd one out, which is statement 3. Now, would I say whether this is an easy question? Not really. If I looked at it and I had only a minute or a minute and a half in the test, I may not necessarily be able to do that. At the same time, if I had to be confused, I would probably be confused perhaps between 3 and 4. After that, if you're stuck between two options, try to match or connect each option with some other statement. Form a mandatory pair. If you're not able to form a mandatory pair, you have probably found the odd one out. And that is what led me to option 3. Let's take a look at this fairly easy odd sentence question. What we will do is we will read each sentence and try to come up with a label for it. A label is nothing but a shorter version of the same statement. Once we have all our labels, it might make it easier for us to see an emerging theme. And once we know the theme, it might be easy for us to see the odd sentence. Let's take a look at our first statement now. Now here we are talking about the banning of northern lights, which I'm going to assume is a book. So banning of northern lights is the topic. The second statement says, attempts to ban books are attempts to silence authors who have summoned immense courage in telling their stories. So this is generally trying to say that banning books perhaps is not the best thing, that it is an attempt to silence authors. The third statement says that banning and challenging books in the US has escalated to an unprecedented level. A lot of books are being banned or challenged in the US. So that becomes my label for this one. The fourth statement says again that the fantasy novel Northern Lights was banned in some parts of the US and was the second most challenged book in the US. So clearly it's a controversial book and it was banned in some parts. So let's just say that. The fifth one says that the American Library Association documented an unparalleled number of reported book challenges in 2022, about 2,500 unique titles. So clearly there have been a lot of books that have been challenged. So unprecedented number of book challenges in the US. The reason that this question is easy is that the theme clearly is banning or challenging books in the US. Once we know this theme, then the odd one out is pretty apparent. If I look at the first one, it talks about Northern Lights, so I can connect that to point number 4. If I look at 2, it does talk about banning books, but it does not really refer to Northern Lights or the US. If I look at 3 and 5, clearly they're making the same points, so I can form another mandatory pair. So even if you're stuck between two options, at the very end, try to see if you can form a mandatory pair, and that will help you out with the answer. In this case, the answer is definitely option 2 because it does not relate to the Northern Lights or the US. So I will say that it's an easy question. Let's take a look at a fairly challenging parajumble question. And when I say challenging, what I mean is that even if I had about 4 or 5 minutes, I probably still would not get to the answer. I mean, I would get an answer, but not the right one. Let's take a look at our first statement. We will be using the sort-link sequence strategy to solve this. Now, the first option says, contemporary African writing like the bottle leopard voices this theme. This theme clearly indicates that I should have mentioned some theme, so this is a follower. The second statement here says, Chukwuemeka Ike explores the conflict and casts the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping, and unaccommodating. So when it says the conflict, I should have mentioned some sort of conflict. So this cannot be my starter either. Now the third statement definitely is not my starter. It says, however, their views contradict the reality. So there are two clues here. However tells me that this is going to contradict the preceding sentence. And when I say their views, there has to be some sort of a viewpoint. So definitely not the starter. Let's look at the fourth one, which has to be the starter, obviously. The fourth one does look like the starter. Western Christian concepts tend to deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. So I would say this is the starter. And now, since I have already read all the statements, I think it's pretty easy to say that 3 should follow. Why should 3 follow? Because Western Christian concepts have a particular viewpoint. However, their views, which refers to Western Christian concepts, clearly contradict the reality. So I have found my first mandatory pair, which is 4 and 3. Now, 50% of the question is done, and this is the only easy 50%. The remaining is actually pretty tough. So let's look at what happens now. We would look at all the statements one more time. We would say, okay, I know that 4 and 3 is the starting. But what do I do with the rest? Is it 1, 2 or is it 2, 1? And this is where the trouble lies. So between these two possibilities, I think for a lot of us, we would probably say that 4, 3, 1, 2 makes sense. Why does it make sense? because we usually progress from the general to the specific. So if you look at statement 1, it says contemporary African writing like the bottle leopard. So it generally seems to talk about contemporary African writing, and the second statement talks about a specific author. So I think most of us will say, okay, this is my answer, and I probably did the same thing. However, there is still the second possibility. Let's try 4-3 and then 2-1. Now this makes sense, but in a slightly different way. We could also say that 2 introduces the author, and when it says the conflict, it clearly talks about the conflict between, let's say, the local African cultural ethos and Western Christian concepts. It could also probably be said that I can first introduce how a particular author deals with the conflict and then talk about a specific example of the same author's work. So at this point, I would say that this is a very, very fine distinction. And in fact, I went back to look at the original text to see what the original text says. And what has happened is that the original text for this question has been edited. If the original text had been retained, I think the answer would make a lot more sense. But given the editing, it becomes very difficult to distinguish between these two possibilities. Ultimately, we have to take the second possibility, 4-3-2-1. It is justified, but it is not very easy to see right then. So the answer is going to be 4-3-2-1. Let's talk about this parajumble question. To some extent, it's very simple, but I think there is one tiny link here that is very easy to miss. We will talk about it when we get to it. First of all, let's use the sort link sequence strategy to figure out the overall sequence. The first statement says, like the ants that make up a colony, no single neuron holds complex information like self-awareness, hope, or pride. Now, this seems to be complete on its own, but it doesn't really seem to introduce the topic. So I would say that this looks more like a follower than a starter. The second statement says, although the human brain is not yet understood enough to identify the mechanism by which emergence functions. Now, there are two issues here that we would grapple with. One, this statement is a little difficult to understand. It talks about something called emergence, but we've not really introduced the concept of emergence. Now here, we would say that most neurobiologists agree that the complex interconnections between the parts give rise to qualities that belong only to the whole. Some of us probably might mistakenly think that I cannot start a paragraph with the word although. But what we have to understand is that the word although introduces contradiction within the sentence. It does not contradict the sentence before this one. So there is no problem with the word although. The problem is that this is a little abrupt and it doesn't really talk about what emergence is. So I would say this is probably the follower, but given the overall look of things, I would say could be the starter as well. Now let's look at the third one. Nonetheless, now this is clearly a follower. Nonetheless, the sum of all neurons in the nervous system generate complex human emotions like fear and joy. I can already see that I have found my first mandatory pair, 1 and 3. Nonetheless, clearly contradicts 1. So we have said that no single neuron holds complex information, but the sum of all neurons do, or does rather. So 1 and 3 must be placed next to each other. Now we have the fourth one. Now this definitely looks like the starter. Human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain, and this now introduces the concept of emergent. So I would say this is most likely the starter, and now I'm going to discard 2 as a possibility. Now let's take a look at what we have so far. We know that 4 is the starter and that 1 and 3 form a mandatory pair. The reason that you see a little dash in the middle is that we don't really know what to do with 2. Most of us, I think, are going to connect 4 and 2 together, and the reason is the word emergence or emergent. The fourth one says that consciousness is an emergent property of the human brain, and 2 also talks about the mechanism by which emergence functions. But this is a very simplistic way of looking at things. What we need to realize is that 4, 1 and 2 are trying to explain something to us in a very simple fashion. They're trying to tell us that individual neurons cannot do much on their own. It is the collective neuron group that actually produces some complex emotions and awareness and so on. So, why is 2 not supposed to be placed between 4 and 1? Because that is what the answer is. We need to understand that 2 actually talks about a somewhat deeper issue. The mechanism by which emergence functions. it's not simply trying to give us an observation. It is trying to delve deeper and trying to say that we don't really understand certain things. So before that, we are merely stating what we know, but by the time we come to statement 2, we are looking at things that we may not really know. And that is why statement 2 should not be placed between 4 and 1, it should be placed at the end. It's a very difficult thing to see, particularly if you have only about 1.5 minutes. Nevertheless, the answer is 4132 and it is perfectly justified. This is a pretty easy essence of the text or summary question. The reason it's easy is that the text is simple and the answer options are also very easy to distinguish between. I would probably say that this can be solved in about 1.5 to 2 minutes. So what we will do is that we will follow our usual XYZ strategy to solve this. What is XYZ? We have to identify the main points and then we have to find an option that captures our main points. As we read this, it first introduces the fact that heat waves are getting worse. Then it says that heat waves do not impact all people the same way. They probably have a greater impact on some groups as compared to others. So I would want to capture these 2 points for sure, that the impact of heat waves is unevenly experienced by people. But after that, it talks about how this is a concern. It says that because people do not realize that they are at risk, they believe that heat waves are not going to affect them even though they're vulnerable to it. As a result, all the warnings about heat events are not very effective. So for example, if there's an announcement that says that the temperatures are on the rise and you should stay within your homes and not venture outside, and I'm feeling, oh, but that's not really going to affect me, I'm not going to heed that warning. And that is what makes the heat wave dangerous. So that becomes my second point, that vulnerable individuals don't really realize that they are at risk and therefore these warnings don't really work so much. So finally, what is one to do? It is the last part where the author makes a recommendation. So whenever there is a paragraph in which the author makes a suggestion or a recommendation or expresses a very clear opinion, make sure that you pick an option that captures that opinion. What we really need to capture is how the media can play a role. So the author is saying that the news media can help warn people and generally create some awareness about the dangers of extreme heat events. So now I have my 3 points. I'm going to try and see if any options match them. Let's take a look at our options and see whether we can find a match. Now the first option looks all right, at least the first half of it, but look at the second half. But they have to become more effective. The effectiveness angle has been mentioned with regard to the warnings about heat waves. Nowhere does the paragraph say that the news stories have to be effective. And that is why option 1 is a distortion. Let's eliminate it. Option 2 says heat waves pose an enormous risk. This is fine. The media plays a pivotal or an important role in alerting people to this danger. This kind of captures my main point and it kind of touches upon X and Y. So it's not a perfect answer, but it's very close to it, primarily because it captures the author's suggestion. So we keep option 2. Option 3 says people are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change. Now this is the very beginning of the paragraph and therefore might seem like this is the right answer. Measures taken are ineffective. This part is a little extreme, and also this option does not talk about what the news media can do. And so option 3 cannot be my answer. It does not really get to the point. Let's eliminate it. Option 4 says protection from heat waves is important, but current reports and public policies seem ineffective. I would eliminate this for the same reason that we did 3. It does not capture the whole role of the news media. So option 4 cannot be my answer. It will have to be option 2. So the easiest way to solve such questions is to look for the author's opinion or suggestion or recommendation, make sure that is adequately represented. Once that is done, then you can look for the remaining details. And therefore, this question should not take you too long. Here we have an essence of the text question. So we're going to use the XYZ strategy to solve it. The passage is fairly short and it's not very difficult to understand. People spontaneously create counterfactual alternatives to reality when they think if only or what if, and imagine how the past could have been different. So this is a situation most of us are familiar with, and that is why it's very easy to understand. This therefore becomes our first point, our point X. The next point is that the mind computes counterfactuals for many reasons, and then it gives us a list of reasons as to why we do this what if analysis. For example, they can help explain the past, help us prepare for the future, they affect intentions and decisions and so on. So we're looking at the various reasons that we do this what if analysis. So that becomes our point Y. It is not essential to remember all these reasons, but it's just good to know that multiple reasons have been offered. But look at the last part of this paragraph. The ability to create counterfactuals develops throughout childhood and contributes to reasoning about other people's beliefs, including their false beliefs. So this is something that we need to take into account because this tells us that it is some sort of a developmental process. So let's keep that as our last point, Z. Now, keeping these 3 points in mind, we're going to evaluate our options, and I think it's fairly easy to arrive at the right option in this case. We have our X, Y, and Z points. Now, please remember that you may not find an option that covers all 3 in great detail. What we need to keep in mind is that if you are not certain about an option, or if you're stuck between 2 options, keep both of them. Don't force yourself to eliminate options in the first go. You can come back and revisit. Let's take a look at our first option. Counterfactual thinking helps to reverse past and future actions and reason out false beliefs. This is fairly easy to eliminate because there is no reversal of past and future actions. It just helps us understand the past and prepare for the future. So, easy to eliminate. Option 2 says, people create counterfactual alternatives to reality for various reasons. This is clearly our point Y, including reasoning about other people's beliefs. This is our point Z. So there is nothing inaccurate about the second option. Let's keep it. Option 3 says counterfactuals help people to prepare for the future by understanding intentions and making decisions. The reason that I would eliminate this is that it is trying to link ideas which have not been linked in the original text. The original paragraph says that counterfactuals help people prepare for the future and understand the past. It also says that it affects people's decisions and actions and so on. But it does not really connect these 2 points as far as I can remember. So let's eliminate option 3. But if you really want to convince yourself, you can also say that it does not really talk about X or Z. It only talks about Y. So for those reasons, I think it is very convincing that we should eliminate the third option. What I'm really likely to be confused about is options 2 and 4. Let's look at the fourth one. Counterfactual alternatives to reality are created for a variety of reasons. This is our point Y, and is part of one's developmental process. This is our point Z. Now, let's look at 2 and 4 together and see which is a better option. If I really look at point number 2, it talks about why we create counterfactual alternatives to reality. It does mention reasoning about other people's beliefs. But if I look at point number 4, it talks about the developmental process, which is actually the main point that is being made in Z. So between 2 and 4, after some degree of deliberation, I might say that 2 is a slightly more limited option and 4 is a more comprehensive one. And therefore, I can eliminate 2 and say that 4 most likely is the answer. So this is a question where you can arrive at the answer, where you might be a little uncertain, but it's still worth taking a shot.